Hey everyone, this is Disc Junkie and welcome back to Reconnected. And so this is a show where I talk about obsolete technology, and today I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite pieces of retro tech, and that is the Sony TC-510-2 5-inch open field recorder. Now, this is a very dear piece of my collection. As you know, I'm very much a movie nerd and a collector of film memorabilia, and the reason for why I wanted to get this specific model of reel-to-reel player in my collection is because this is the exact same model of recorder that was featured in the opening sequence to David Fincher's Mindhunter. Now, I will say that the recorder on the show is actually the Japanese equivalent, known as the TC-5550-2. But aside from the model number that's actually printed on it, they are literally the same machine. The TC-510-2 was sold for the international or American market, while the TC-5550-2 was sold for the Japanese market. So that's all it is to it. They are essentially virtually the same machine. It's just a model number that differs. Now, I do want to talk about the player in particular, but I also want to talk about the microphone and the microphone stand and the reels, which are very sort of specific for the Mindhunter intro. And I know a lot of fans have had a very difficult time trying to figure out exactly where these accessories came from, and I do want to dive into that a little bit. So first of all, we can just bring our attention to the player. So I'm going to move some of the stuff out of the way. We essentially have the microphone, but I also have a power adapter, which is not original. This is just one of your typical sort of generic AC/DC adapters, which you can essentially change the voltage on. So yeah, this is definitely not a collectible by any means, but I will say that all of these sort of accessories in general are really hard to come by these days, and so I'm actually really glad that I bought these when I did. And this player in particular, I would say that I picked up this in the summer of 2018, and the show premiered in 2017. So I mean, directly when I watched the show, I was just so sort of smitten with this design of the intro and the player, and just felt like, okay, I gotta own one of those players. And based on that, I started researching the whole history of this, trying to figure out where it was from, and it was actually really difficult to figure out what this was back then. And so for starters, I thought we'd just take a brief look at the machine from some various angles. And I'm gonna try to bring this up because it is actually quite a heavy piece of machinery. It essentially weighs something like 6.8 kilos. So yeah, you'll have to excuse me if I'm not particularly smooth when handling this. So looking on this side, we have a number of sort of ports and stuff, and I'm not going to get into too much of the technicality as to looking at the ports and what they're for, but I will try to give you a detailed look so you can figure that out for yourself, because I'm probably not as technologically knowing as you are, and I know there's a lot of videos out there which will show you a much better detailed view and talk about the specifications, and I will link some of those in the video description. Now, the thing I removed here is actually the original battery pack, so you can essentially open this up, which kind of difficult to do with one hand, but yeah, you will essentially get a bunch of diesel batteries in here, and then you can just insert this piece and run it on batteries. Now, I did try to do that, but it didn't actually work, so I am going to use the power adapter for this video. But just for now, we're just going to take a brief look at all of these sides so you can see the details, and I will also move in on the little sticker there just so you can see that. And let's go ahead and turn to the other side. Whew, okay, so here we have the right side of the machine. You can see everything there. And here is also the bottom portion, which doesn't really have much on it. There's essentially just 4 little rubbery feet. But aside from that, that is pretty much it. Whew. And there I need to take a bit of a break because this is exhausting. Now, I will show you one more thing before we continue, and that is the back portion, which essentially has this little locking mechanism for the plastic cover. If you just pull this little sprint, you can essentially lift off the cover. Now you will need to open the lock in the front, but if you just tilt this a little bit, we'll get the lid off just like that. So it's fairly easy to do, and then you can put that to the side. I think we're actually going to do that right now because we are going to take a detailed look at the machine. I'm sorry if I'm hitting the camera stand a little bit because I am reaching around with my arm, so I will tend to do that. Hopefully that's something you can just overlook. All right, so here we have the reel-to-reel player. Now I will say that mine is not working 100%, and we will also be looking at that towards the end of the video, try to see if we can do some repairs, maybe figure out what's wrong with it, because yeah, right now the player is essentially running one of the reels as soon as plug in the, you know, power cable to it, and it's not supposed to do that. It doesn't really listen to the various changes I make when I sort of move the various controls. And just to show you, here on the front you have a whole bunch of things. There's all kinds of knobs, and I'm not going to dig into the detail, but you essentially have this really big and really cool looking turn thing, which you know, you can turn it and twist it to record. There's a stop mode, and then you have the playback. There's also a fast forward and a small knob which you need to pull out in order to pull it down, like so. That's the fast forward. And then you have rewind in the other position. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on. You got a bright sort of orange pause button at the top. And yeah, so we are going to see if we can figure this out and see if we can get it working. But before we dive into that, I desperately need to talk about the reels. Now, on the show, these reels are featured sort of, you know, only in the intro really, because the player that is actually featured on the show, like during the scenes, this is the same player, but I don't think we ever see the metal reels on the show aside from in the intro, which is kind of interesting. Now, the reels themselves are a bit of a mystery, and I think this is one of the most difficult pieces for collectors to find, because the truth of the matter is that the original reels that were used on the show were actually 100% custom made. This is quite hard to believe, seeing as I found these reels, which were from a German brand which is known as Uher, and these are essentially 5-inch metal reels which actually come in different sizes. So these are the 5-inch version or the 13cm version, but they are actually more common in the 7-inch version, which wouldn't actually fit on this player. So if you are going to go look for these, you really do need to pay attention to the real size, because the 5-inch and the 7-inch are virtually identical when you look at the photos, but then when you get them, they are different sizes. And I will also say that these are actually really hard to find. I bought these some years ago, and I think I paid something like 25 euro maybe for them. I don't know. Looking online now and checking eBay prices, I see that these tend to go for something like 100 euro and more. So I'm definitely happy that I picked them up when I did. And I haven't really talked about the price for this machine. I bought this back in 2018. I essentially found a UK seller who had this listed, and I ended up winning it for 251 UK pounds. And I think I ended up spending 83 pounds to get it shipped from a friend in the UK to me in Sweden. So yeah, that is a whole lot of money. However, if you look at the prices today, trying to find a machine like this, you know, both the TC-510-2 and the TC-5550-2, you're probably going to be paying like 3 or 4 times that at least if you're going to get one in working order. Now, this does have some blemishes to it. It's not in perfect sort of visual condition, but I absolutely love it to death. And I want to give a really big thank you to DVD Mike 007 in the UK, who actually shipped this player to me, and he also helped me acquire the mic stand a few years later. So a really big thank you to Mike for that. So I was talking about the reels, and I want to mention that the original reels on the show were custom made. These were essentially made by a company known as KCP Studios, that is essentially Kenny's Custom Props Studios. And there's even a blink and you miss it shot where you can see a partial KCP logo at the center of the reel. Now this was actually meant to go on the underside of the reel, but for whatever reason someone flipped it during a take and it actually made it into the intro. And the guy running Kenny's Custom Props is Kenneth Palco, and so he was actually the custom designer who made the actual reels for the show, and he also worked on the player specifically because, believe it or not, the actual player used on the show is not just like a out-of-the-box player. It's not like they just bought one of these and put it on the show. No, David Fincher was very specific about how he wanted this player to look, and the primary reason, as I understand it, is that he really wanted a very sort of clean player. And when they're shooting this with like the super cameras and whatnot in really sort of close-up fashion, you would be seeing a lot of sort of debris and dirt and scratches, and he didn't want that. So basically what Kenneth Palco did is that he essentially had to rebuild one of these things, sort of replacing 40 to 60% of the machine, just because David Fincher wanted a very sort of sleek look. And I think they actually sort of remade the entire metal portion of the cover, and it's just a really bizarre process as to understanding how much they actually changed, which you don't really pick up on when you're watching the intro. But that is also so much a part of how David Fincher works. I mean, if you look at this show in particular, there's so many scenes where there's like this invisible portion of CGI which you would never think was there, and it looks so good that you don't even notice it. And yeah, that's just the way it is, and that's sort of part of why I love David Fincher's movies so much. And so, like I said, the reels are custom made originally, but these reels are not custom made, and it surprises me because these German Juher reels, they are so close to the actual reel. Some minor things that changes is that the reels on the show will have these two bolts on the metal, which are not apparent here. Now, I have seen some Juher reels which actually have bolts on the side, but for one reason or another, mine does not. I will also mention that if I turn this around, you will see that they originally had a black sticker in the middle. And so this is actually removable. You can just peel this off. So this is what I did for this portion to get a more sort of authentic looking reel design. And so they originally had the sticker on both sides. So that's something to know when you're sort of looking for this and you see this, you might think like, oh, that's not the right reel, but it is. You can actually peel this off. It's really easy to do. And so I want to talk a little bit more about custom reels, because there's essentially a company in America which is called Righteous Reels, and I heard these mentioned in another video by TECHMOAN, and I will link this below as well. And he mentioned that they essentially make a Mindhunter custom reel. Now, as far as, you know, sort of authenticity and screen accuracy, I do think that maybe these are closer. There are some differences to think about, and obviously these don't have the side bolts which appear in the show, but the custom reels that I've seen from Righteous Reels also have 3 bolts, whereas, you know, on the show there's only 2 bolts. So you're gonna have to compare screen grabs and stuff to actually figure out what you want. But yeah, this is essentially the options that are available for you. And the other part of this video is obviously to talk about the accessories, because this is essentially what make up this wonderful piece of prop replica. And once you've sourced the reels, which is really a big part of this, you are definitely going to want to pick up the proper microphone. And this is also a bit of a mystery, because a lot of people will think that they actually use a Sony microphone, but in reality they are actually using a Sony mic stand and a microphone known as the Super Scope EP05 condenser microphone. I'm going to try to bring this up so you can see a little bit of the detail on the microphone, but it might be a little bit difficult to focus and the lighting and stuff. But yeah, this is definitely the proper microphone. It looks a bit weird, and I was able to add this to the mic stand simply by, you know, adding some tape in there to actually make it fit. And yeah, so this became quite an easy prop, but it actually took quite a bit of time to find all these parts, and that's also part of why I sort of been putting off on making a video about this item. And so as far as the mic stand goes, this is branded with a Sony logo. There's really not much to talk about in terms of the, you know, underside of it, but I will mention that this is a A16 stand, and I actually have the original box for this, just so you can confirm this. This is what you're looking for, the Sony A16 microphone table stand. And yeah, the box itself is fairly uninteresting. There's really not much in there. There's a small adapter thing, which is also placed on the stand as it is now. But yeah, so this you can probably find fairly cheap. I got mine from the UK. It cost me €5 and the shipping. And I think, you know, with all these sort of transfer and import fees and whatnot, I think it added something like 20 or 25 euros. So yeah, even there, you know, it's really difficult to source some of these old items. As far as the mic, I think I imported these from a company called reverb.com in the US. This was also not a super sort of expensive item. I think I paid something like maybe $11 or such, but with all the shipping, I mean, we're talking 20 or 30 euro in total to get it here. So yeah. But now I'm gonna move the microphone to the side and we are going to pay a little bit more attention to the player itself, because I do want to plug this in, and like I said, I'm just using a universal regulated AC/DC adapter. And the thing is that as soon as I plug this in, you will see that the reels are essentially starting to move. So this is obviously a big part of the problem. Here you can see it. As soon as I plug this in, the reel is spinning out of control and I can't really do anything to fix it. So I'm gonna go ahead and unplug this for now. And before we can actually look at how to solve this, we need to get into the machine. And this, I have to say, has been one of my biggest issues, because there literally aren't any good sort of English language instructions. Usually you'll find everything on YouTube, but I really haven't found a lot in terms of, you know, figuring out how to open this up, how to service it. It's just a very sort of limited field in terms of trying to figure out what to do. And so that's also part of why I wanted to make this video, because I'm really hoping that we can figure this out, that we can get this to working condition. And the first step in order to do so would be to actually open up this, to get into it. And I did make some attempts to do this, and hopefully I will be able to sort of recreate that, and we'll see how far we can get and what we can do once we open this up. Because part of the thing which I have sort of come to think about with this, when I first got it, I didn't have the problem with the spinning reel when I put the power on. So I think that's something that essentially happened because this has just been, you know, sitting on my table. I haven't really done with it, and I think there's some mechanics inside which might have dried up, like maybe it just needs some lubrication and stuff, and then we'll get it back to working order, but we'll see. So the first thing you'll need to do in order to open this is actually to remove the reels. You have these classic little metal rings which you just, you know, twist to the sides like so. They're essentially like lug nuts, and then you can essentially lift these up. Here we can also see one of these stickers which is essentially starting to peel off. So yeah, it's really easy to remove these and just clean them, and then you have a very sort of clean looking surface like this, which I think is, you know, much more close to what you see on the show. But I will also mention that, you know, reels like this, especially the 5-inch reels, are essentially much more common on plastic reels. Here's just some examples for you, and you know, these come in all shapes and sizes, and a lot of the time the boxes for these will be really beautiful. I mean, I for one really like this sort of design of these old boxes. They just look really cool in terms of technology, and you know, I've picked up some of these just to have them sitting on my shelf because I just really like this old design. But now that we've come this far, we're gonna start by just removing 4 bolts, which are positioned here, 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 and here. Now, these are removed quite simply. You just need the proper screwdriver. I don't really know what this particular size is called, so yeah, you're just gonna have to look that up, but they're fairly easy to remove, and they're actually quite small. Can just take a brief look at how small that is. And I will also say that the TDK leader that is featured on the reels in the show, that is actually a non-existent leader. So that is essentially a digital composition. So if you're going out looking for that, you're not going to find it. So just forget about that and settle for a non-TDK leader. So once the screws are removed, it should be fairly easy to remove this, but there's still 2 parts which are essentially obstructing this from happening. And that is these 2 small but not insignificant little spools here. Now, when I first started working on this, I was absolutely frustrated at this portion because I looked at these and I'm like trying to pull them off, and I can't really do that, and I'm afraid to break something, and I don't understand how these come off because obviously they need to. I can't lift the metal up before I remove these. And then I finally found like an old schematic of how this thing is actually put together. And as it turns out, this is actually a 2-piece thing. And so you essentially have to twist the top off like so, and within you will actually find a small metal clamp, and this is essentially holding the entire knob down. Now, I actually removed this myself and I couldn't really get the clamp back, And so I just decided not to, because in all honesty, these don't really need the clamp on there to work. And if you don't place it back there, you can just lift this up like so. And even with the plastic cover on it, these don't fall around because they actually hit the sort of plastic sealing of this cover. So you don't really need to worry about those. Unless, of course, you're trying to use this in an open sort of field recorder without the cover and you're lugging it around, then obviously these would fall off. But I'm rambling, so let's just continue with this presentation. And as far as the metal top portion, this is essentially just held in place with this sort of rubber little lining which goes all the way around. But when you are trying to remove this, it is essentially important that you start at the back of the machine, because right in front is essentially a small little hatch thingy, which we are going to see once we peel this off. So just be careful doing this. Make sure that you're not getting stuck on, some of these portions, and you want to lift it fairly straight. Just make sure that you're getting past these things. And once you do that, like so, at this point, you're going to be pulling it a little bit backwards. And just like that, hopefully. There we go. So here you can see that there is essentially a small metal piece on the underside, which is locking in. So you're not going to have to start from the back. That is essentially very important. But yeah, this is the metal piece, the way it looks. And we can just place that to the side for now. And now actually look at some of the inner workings of this machine, which, I mean, it's just such a beautiful machine. I love this, and I can't really stop talking about it. And so let's continue and see if we can figure out just what the hell is going on. Just go ahead and plug this in. And right away it starts to spin in a sort of clockwise motion. Now if I turn this to rewind, it does stop, but it doesn't rewind. Back to the sort of neutral mode, it starts spinning it again. And if I go to fast forward, I will say that it spins faster in the fast forward motion. So you might not pick up on that on camera, but it definitely does. Then if we switch to record, nothing really happens. And switch to playback. Yeah, obviously the little gears and stuff are moving, but as far as the sort of real spinning motion, it doesn't really get affected by this. I will say that the play position does seem to slow down the reel. You can probably see, but then back to stop mode, it speeds up again. And at this point I decided to do something which I rarely do in my videos, and that is to record the dialogue in post-production. And as part of my troubleshooting, I even stumbled over a free service manual at archive.org, and I'll be sure to link this in the video description. It is quite a technical document, but it did provide some useful info as I was trying to understand the overall mechanics of this machine, so I highly suggest you to check it out. Now, after about an hour of troubleshooting, I realized that this arm shouldn't be stuck in the same position when you're trying to run the rewind function. I didn't really associate this with my constantly spinning reel, but at the same time, you gotta start somewhere. And I also tried to activate the rewind function while simultaneously pushing the arm towards the left reel hub, and that's when things got really interesting. Oh! And so as a result of these findings, I decided that I would probably have to dismantle the machine a bit further. And if you are just looking to replace your drive belts, you would actually need to go through the same steps that I'm doing. And the first thing that you would have to do is actually to clear a path for the player's motor. Now, this step isn't 100% mandatory if you're just looking to replace your drive belts, but it will definitely make things easier depending on what your ultimate goal is, so I still highly suggest you to go through with it. So we're going to start off by flipping the player on its side and remove the 4 screws that are holding the feet and the bottom plate in position. Once this is done, there are 3 additional screws holding down the circuit board. The 4 screws on the opposite side of the circuit board are actually connected to a hinge, and so this will give you an easy way to access things without having to remove the entire board. After that, you will want to pull off the metal cover on the bottom of the motor. This can be a bit tricky as there's a metal bar somewhat obstructing the motor, but with a little force you should be able to clear it. And I'm actually using a flat-headed screwdriver at this point, just to be able to nudge the cover past the bar. And so once the cover is removed, you will find 3 screws that are holding down this metal plate. Now if you remove these screws and take away the plate, then the wires running from the motor will be able to pass through the compartment for the motor a lot easier when you're trying to lift it out from the other side. And like I said, I don't think this is really mandatory. As you can see, there's even some additional space at the bottom left side of the motor where the wires are supposed to pass through. But generally, I just think it's a good idea to remove this plate because it will definitely lessen the risk of you accidentally clipping the wires as you are trying to pull the motor out from the other side. And you should also consider untangling some of the wires running from the motor, as well as maybe opening up the zip ties that are connecting these wires to the rest of the harnesses, because you will definitely appreciate that extra wire length when you are trying to remove the motor in the later steps. And I didn't actually do this during my process because I wasn't aware that this metal cover was in place, but if I had done it, it would definitely have made things easier, as you will see in the later part of the video. So at this point you will want to retrace your steps and leave the metal cover and the metal plate removed as you reposition and fasten the circuit board back to its original position. And I think that you should also remount the base of the player and add the rubber feet again, as this will protect the circuit board while you're working on the rest of the player. And with all of this out of the way, we are going to flip the player once more and turn our attention to the top. This is where I started my process, and so now we're going to look at how you actually gain access to the drive belt as well as those wheel arms that are stuck in my scenario. Now, if you have your player laying flat on the table, you can begin by removing these 3 screws, which are essentially holding down the entire head unit. But if you have your player positioned on its side, like I do in this video, you may actually want to make this your final step before you lift out the head unit. And so now let's proceed by removing this little spring, as well as this little E-clip, which is connecting one of the metal arms to the head unit. Then you'll want to disconnect these 2 cable harnesses between the left and right reel hub. Once the connectors are out of the way, you can proceed by loosening this little screw next to the wheel under the head unit. You don't really have to unscrew this all the way, but you will have to loosen it, as this screw is holding down a metal piece which is actually obstructing the arm from the wheel under the center of the head unit. Once we have moved this little metal piece to the side, we should be able to push the 2 wheels to the side in unison. And in case your wheels aren't stuck like mine are, you may consider using a paper clip to secure them, as this will prevent the wheels from moving back towards the motor, where they are actually obstructing the motor from being lifted out of its compartment. And so with all that done, you can now remove the 3 screws that are holding down the head unit, in case you didn't already do that. Once that's done, you can unthread the drive belt from the reel hub, and then you can just lift the entire head unit to remove it from its compartment. However, in my scenario, you'll have to remember that I didn't actually remove the metal plate, and so with this said, my motor essentially got stuck halfway, and I ended up just twisting it and letting it rest on a couple of boxes to proceed with my operation. Now at this point you should be able to remove the drive belt by just moving it over the entire head unit. I didn't actually do this in my scenario, but you should be able to in case you do want to replace the drive belt. Now for me, I decided to remove the 2 E-clips that are on the top of the arms that I'm trying to gain access to. And once the E-clips were removed, I proceeded with a pair of pliers and essentially just pushed 2 arms off of its poles. Now, this was a bit worrying for me because the arms were really stuck on the pins or the poles, and so I was quite worried that they would eventually break. But with enough force, you should be able to push both of these arms off of their poles, and then we're going to proceed by trying to clean them up. And so at this point, I decided to use some WD-40. Now I know this isn't optimal, you're probably supposed to apply some grease, but this is kind of what I had at home. And I will say that they cleaned up quite nicely, and you can sort of see a comparison here between the pole that I did clean and the one that I didn't clean, just to see how much difference it actually makes. Now once the 2 poles or pins were cleaned, I decided to reposition the arms and test them out. And seeing if they were moving freely, I thought it was high time to just retrace my steps and actually test out the functionality once everything was back in place. And so for a quick summary, you'll want to rethread the drive belt, remount the 3 screws that are holding the head unit, reposition the little metal piece and tighten the screw that comes with it, reattach the cable harnesses to their connectors, reattach this E-clip, and finally reattach this spring. And with all that done, you'll obviously need to reposition the metal cover, reposition the metal spools, reopen the back, reposition the metal plate and the metal cover for the motor, and finally close everything back up again. And so here we are. We are actually going to test this. Now I did do this already, but just to show you what has essentially happened. Now when I do plug the power back in, you will notice that the right reel is spinning still, so we haven't been able to solve that problem. However, I will also say that when I hit the rewind switch, as such, the rewind function actually works, so we were at least able to solve that. And once I go back to the neutral position or the stop position, the right reel starts spinning again. So, you know, not everything was solved today, and I've spent quite a bit of time on this. We can test out the playback function as well, which does the same thing as before, it just slows down the wheel a little bit. Record as well, push it in, turn it, it does stay in position, but aside from that, it doesn't really do much. Now, one of the things I can show you, which I think I forgot to mention earlier, is that these two VU meters actually have a light to them. Now, I'm not really sure if you can pick up on this, but they are in fact working. I think there is a light check. Well, in any case, the light meters do work, but it's really hard to show them in this lighting. Now, as far as like the counter and everything like that, I'm not really sure what to say. The only thing that I've essentially been able to fix is the rewind function. So maybe this needs to have replacements on drive belts. I don't know if that's the problem. And if anybody has any suggestions as to how I might be able to fix the fact that the right reel is constantly spinning, do leave a comment. I really appreciate this. But if nothing else, I really hope that this video has inspired you to try and fix one of these machines yourself, so you have one that isn't working, and hopefully now you know a little bit more about how to at least gain access to the machine, because this can be quite a troublesome task. And so with all that said, I think I'm about to end it. I do want to show you one of the things which I forgot to mention earlier in the video, which is just the general functionality of the top lid. So you have this little locking button here, which you push from both sides, and that allows you to essentially flip this beautiful sort of acrylic lid open. And like I showed you earlier, you can also remove it if you just move one of the little locking things on the back here, so you can actually lift that off. But yeah, so that's one of my final demonstrations of this absolutely spectacular looking Sony TC-510-2. And lastly, I want to give a big shout out to TECHMOAN and also to Adam Savage from Tested. They have both made their own videos on this specific machine, and these were a really big inspiration for me to make my video, so I highly suggest you to check those out. You will find them in the video description. But that's it, and so now I want to say thank you very much for watching, and as usual, hope to see you all next time.